think she went to get her book.
Okay, we're live.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, speakers and people watching. My name is Alice McKeon. I'm a writer, a political historian, and most recently worked on a book with Chuck Robb right here, his memoir called In the Arena. Thank you, David. And that's David Mixner, renowned political activist known for his decades of work in human rights and LGBTQ rights. And with us also is Sasha Issenberg, a journalist and author of 4 books, most recently The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. And going to be joining us shortly is Jonathan Martin, national political correspondent for the New York Times. And today we're going to be talking about the Defense of Marriage Act and Chuck Robb's decision to become the only Southern senator to vote against it. We're going to talk about how and why the issue got there, how Robb got to the issue, and how it affected his career and the political landscape. And we'll get to see a few clips from the truly excellent speech that he gave to try and convince his fellow senators 25 years ago today to join him. So let's kick it off with the very beginning of the speech. Mary, can we get a clip?
The senator from Virginia is recognized.
Madam President, as one who represents a traditionally conservative state, it's not easy to take on this issue. In fact, many of my friends and supporters have urged me to sit this one out because of the potential political fallout. But I can't do that. I feel very strongly that this legislation is fundamentally wrong, and feeling as I do, I would not be true to my conscience or my oath of office if I failed to speak out against it. I believe we have an obligation to confront the very real implications of the so-called Defense of Marriage Act. Despite its name, the Defense of Marriage Act does not defend marriage against some imminent crippling threat. Maintaining the freedom of states to define a civil union or a legal right to benefits cannot and will not harm the strength and power of marriage. Neither can it diminish the love between a husband and wife or the devotion they feel toward their children.
Oh, and there's Jonathan. Welcome. Hi.
Hey, guys.
Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, son of Virginia joining us.
So let's start off with Sasha.
Yeah. Thank you, Alice. And thanks, David, Jonathan, for being here on the 25th anniversary. So, one question is, how does this end up on the floor of the Senate? When Chuck Robb gets elected to the Senate in 1988, gay marriage is not an issue in any meaningful way in our politics. There was barely a politician in the United States who'd ever been asked his or her opinion on this. There was not a gay rights organization in the country that had endorsed marriage rights as an objective. And there was a whole lot of anti-gay activism coming from a sort of ascendant, largely evangelical religious right, but they were trying to limit all sorts of forms of citizenship for LGBT people, but they were not actively trying to stop gays and lesbians from marrying because there was not an active effort underway anywhere in the country to do that. And in my book, I start in Hawaii, where almost a sort of accidental series of events leads to a lawsuit in 1991. And in May of 1993, to the surprise of everybody there, the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples. And it takes a while for the issue to migrate to the mainland. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the first real institution on the mainland to properly take stock of the consequences of this landmark decision in Hawaii. And among the things that the Mormon Church does is sort of raise the alarm among other religious activists in the country. And it basically takes 3 years from the time that the Hawaii Supreme Court rules for this to land with any urgency in Congress. And there are 2 simultaneous efforts underway. There's a bill that's being drafted in the House by Bob Barr, a Republican from Georgia, that focuses on confirming to states that they have the authority on, despite the full faith and credit clause, to treat same-sex marriages from other states differently than they would treat opposite-sex marriages. And then a separate provision that's being hatched by Don Nichols on the Senate side that focuses on the federal definition of marriage and basically says that it's like 1,147 or something places in the federal code that the U.S. government treats people differently based on whether or not they're married. Social Security, survivor death benefits, who gets buried in a veteran cemetery with a spouse. In every one of those instances that the federal government will treat the words marriage, spouse to apply only to opposite sex couples. And these two things get fused. Introduced in May of 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act has these basically two operative provisions. And Bill Clinton, sort of like Chuck Robb, in his political profile, I think one could say, sort of looks at it, and in his the first instinct of the White House is to ignore it, to treat this as a kind of sort of provocation being thrown out by Republicans on the Hill in an election year. And their idea is that it might not ever even come for a hearing. They might just be doing this to as we'd say, win a news cycle, maybe try to create a wedge issue. And the idea, and Clinton's first instinct is let's not take the bait. Mike McCurry at White House press briefings tries to avoid talking about it for a few days. It becomes clear that that's an unsustainable position. And by the end of May, Clinton has made clear that if the bill comes to his desk, he will sign it. But there's still an expectation among Democrats that Republicans still might not bother taking a vote, especially if it would now give Clinton the opportunity to take the more conservative position on the issue. And so the House ends up voting on this in July of 1996. Overwhelming margin, 69 votes, I believe, against one Republican, Steve Gunderson, who was openly gay. And the 68 Democrats who voted against it were pretty much the most liberal, largely white members of the Democratic caucus. Only a handful of Latino and African American congressmen, including John Lewis, voted against DOMA. And so it was pretty clear that this was going to come to the Senate in the fall, and that it would pass the Senate by an overwhelming margin, and that Bill Clinton would sign it when it did.
All right. Let's see another clip from the speech.
Openly before now, fear that anyone who expressed an understanding view of the plight of homosexuals was likely to be labeled one. Because of this fear, the battle against discrimination has been left to those who were directly affected by it. Mr. President, Madam President, I believe it is time for those of us who are not homosexuals to show a basic respect for human dignity, which gives us the strength to reject racial, gender, religious intolerance, dictates that America, we also eliminate discrimination against homosexuals. I believe that ending this discrimination is the last frontier in the ultimate fight for civil and human rights. Most Americans accept the basic tenet that discrimination for any reason is wrong. We grow uncomfortable, however, with some of its implications. The question we face now is whether that discomfort warrants continued discrimination. Although we've made huge strides in the struggle against discrimination based on gender, race, and religion, it's more difficult to see beyond our differences regarding sexual orientation. It's human nature to be uncomfortable with feelings we don't understand or share, and to step away from those who are different. But it's also human resolve that allows us to overcome those impulses, to step forward, and to celebrate the many qualities that we share. The fact that our hearts don't all speak in the same way is not cause or justification to discriminate.
Okay, that's a great one. So the next question is, how did Chuck Robb, who even looks like a conservative, standing there giving that speech with perfect pocket square, how did he become
like a Marine?
Like exactly. How did the Marine Corps man here become this advocate for for gay rights and for gay marriage. There's a couple of important things to remember with how Chuck Robb got to this point. The first one is that this is not his first progressive social position. This is not somebody who had been socially conservative across the board and then all of a sudden came out about gay marriage, as it were. He is a physical conservative. He did have a strong national security presence, but had been socially progressive the entire time that he'd been in the Senate and before. He had already publicly supported gays in the military back in 1992, even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was Don't Ask, Don't Tell. When General Powell testified before Congress before Clinton was president in February of 1992, he wrote Powell a letter that opposed the banning of gays in the military. And he had also come out on socially progressive issues like gun control. He had come out against the ban on flag burning based on reading the Scalia opinion about the First Amendment, and made a rational decision that this, as much as he didn't like flag burning as a Marine and someone who had been to Vietnam and fought in combat, that it was a First Amendment right. And so he publicly supported it and went on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech. So, this comes out of his history of being socially progressive. And one big difference that I find interesting coming out of some of Sasha's book about different allies in this fight, many of them I have found have a close family member who is gay, that, a kid comes out and that moves them on this issue. Not so with Chuck Robb. He did not have a close family member at all that was gay. This was not from personal experience. This was a rational choice. Once he decided that is that sexual preference was not a choice, that it was a logical conclusion that this was discrimination. And you also have to remember that his first encounter with this issue was while he was in the Marines. He was in JAG. He was reviewing personnel reports and came across the reports of two people who were being dishonorably discharged for accusations that they were gay. It wasn't even because of conduct, and their conduct was otherwise exemplary. And seeing that kind of in black and white really in front of him, that struck him as completely unfair, and that an institution like the Marine Corps, which is meant at its core to be a meritocracy, to have that institution discriminate against Marines because they were even accused of being gay was a real jolt to the system, and that really that stuck with him. So I recently talked to Chuck Robb about this issue, and I have a short, not the best audio of it, but a short clip to play about this. Mary, if you could cue that up for me. Hopefully you guys will be able to hear it. The audio problem was on my end. I'm sorry, I screwed that up.
My core beliefs, and I thought that I was not selling a bill of goods. I thought I was selling the honest truth if you look at it objectively. And this bill is just designed to discriminate against people who are different. And I felt that was fundamentally wrong.
And the next, hopefully you could hear some of that. The next clip of the speech also gets at what he was talking about there, is that he is going to talk in the next clip about how he decided that sexual preference was not a choice. And once he came to that decision, he is a very rationalist decision maker. If sexual preference is not a choice, then treating someone different because of it is discrimination, and that's wrong, period. And there was never any question that he was going to vote against this. It wasn't unlike some other stories about votes, and this makes it very hard PS to write about, because there isn't a long process with Chuck Robb about coming to this decision. This was always going to be the decision. He was always going to vote against this. So Mary, if you could play that clip number 2.
These are important issues, Madam President, and they deserve a full discussion, but they are not the issues that make this debate so difficult or so important. For beneath the high-minded discussion of constitutional principles and states' rights lurks the true issue which confounds us and divides us. The issue of how we feel about intimate conduct we neither understand nor feel comfortable discussing. Mr. President, scientists have not yet discovered what causes homosexuals to be attracted to members of their own sex. For the vast majority of us, those who don't hear that particular drummer, it's difficult to fully comprehend such an attraction. But homosexuality has existed throughout human history. And even though medical research hasn't succeeded in telling us why a small but significant number of our fellow human beings have a different sexual orientation, the clear weight of serious scholarship has concluded that people do not choose to be homosexual any more than they choose their gender or their race, or any more than we choose to be heterosexual. And given the prejudice too often directed toward gay people, and the pressure that they feel to hide the truth, their very identities in some cases, from family, friends, and employers, it's hard to imagine why anyone would actually choose to bear such a heavy burden unnecessarily. The fact of the matter is that we can't change who we are or how God made us. And that realization is increasingly accepted by succeeding generations. It has been my experience that more and more high school and college students today accept individual classmates as straight or gay without emotion or stigma.
Now, I think, Sasha, if you could touch on how, the votes and how ENDA kind of changed the DOMA dynamic.
Yeah. So the Employment Non-Discrimination Act was the bill that gay rights activists and lobbyists hoped that they would be dealing with in the House and Senate in 1995 and 1996. There have been efforts to introduce a gay rights bill dating back to the early mid-1970s when Bala Abzug and Ed Koch sponsored what was called the Equality Act. It never went anywhere in the House of Representatives. That would have basically written sexual orientation into the country's set of civil rights protections next to race and sex and religion. And there was an effort in 1994 to sort of, as gay rights lobbyists became sort of better connected, more professionalized on the Hill. There was a Democratic president who stood ready to sign a gay rights bill into law. The focus was on pushing the gay rights bill to have the strongest chance of passage, and that was one that just focused on workplace discrimination. And so the Employment Non-Discrimination Act was introduced in 1994, but when Democrats lost control of Congress that fall, it was basically obviously not going to move in a Republican-controlled legislature. And so, but it gets revived after the Defense of Marriage Act gets introduced in the spring of 1996. And it comes back because there's a sort of strategy that's hatched by the Human Rights Campaign, whose chief lobbyist, Daniel Zingali, was working very closely with Ted Kennedy's office then, to introduce ENDA, the workplace discrimination bill, as an amendment to DOMA. Republicans would see this as what they call a poison pill, something that makes it less appealing for them. The idea was, this was far more broadly popular. There was polling that showed maybe 70% of Americans thought that sexual orientation should not be a factor in hiring and firing and salary decisions. And so Kennedy's decision was that, that basically you might be able to make something good out of something bad, that if DOMA passes and you succeed in attaching ENDA to it, you would at least be able to pass the Senate with this high priority gay rights bill. And so there's a back and forth through the summer, but it's clear that about how these things are going to be related. And Mary, can you throw up the first image? So Senator Don Nichols, who was the Senate, sort of took the Senate lead on the DOMA bill. This is from, I believe, early summer in his office. It's a little hard to make out, but it's a tracking sheet of a whip count of votes on both DOMA and ENDA. So they are going around and trying to take stock of where the votes are on this issue. You could see Robb is seen as a no on DOMA from the outset. But they're counting votes. It's pretty clear that DOMA is going to go down. Is going to pass overwhelmingly. And the fear among Republicans is that this actually could force a tough choice for their more moderate members on ENDA. And so the deal that Kennedy ends up striking with Trent Lott, the Senate Majority Leader, is that instead of this amendment move, which Republicans have now come to fear, Lott will offer a simultaneous vote on, or concurrent votes on the same day on the two bills. The Defense of Marriage Act will get a standalone vote. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act will get a standalone vote, and they will be free of amendments. You'll get clean votes on both of them. And that vote ends up being scheduled for September 9th, 1996, 25 years ago today, which also happens to be the day that in Honolulu, the first ever trial on same-sex marriage begins. And what the sort of the gay rights lobbyists find is that ENDA really does change the dynamic around DOMA. So a lot of Democrats who, might have been feeling some pressure to cast a vote against this anti-gay marriage bill realize that if they can cast, but are afraid of being seen to voters, being perceived as being sort of too far left on the issue, realize that if they can cast a simultaneous vote against DOMA, that it gives them a lot more cover to vote for ENDA. One of the, Fritz Hollings, an even more conservative
Very Southern
than Chuck Robb, says he'll support ENDA. Clear, no doubt that he's going to vote for DOMA, but it becomes safer for him to support ENDA. Harry Reid, who came to be seen as a friend of gay rights activists, was not Mormon, not particularly liberal on social issues at the time. Similarly, comes aboard, supports ENDA because he can vote against DOMA at the same time. And the folks who are lobbying on this issue, Kennedy's office is taking the lead. The White House is very invested in getting ENDA through the Senate. Realize it becomes very good that you could go to members on these two questions and basically tell them you just want a yes on one of them. So the two things come up to a vote. Chuck Robb is the 14th vote in an 85-14 vote in favor of DOMA. Mary, can you throw up the other vote tally? And so he's giving a speech explaining why he's one of this lowly 14. But the thing that happens that day that ends up feeling more momentous for gay rights activists is that ENDA comes one vote short. You see in the bottom right-hand corner there, this is a vote tally being kept by Ted Kennedy, who, as you saw in the in that clip, was leading the floor debate. So it gets a 49-50. The 50th vote, another moderate Southern Democrat, would have been David Pryor. Al Gore was sort of at the ready to cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate on this. Pryor was by the bedside of his son, Mark, who later became a senator himself in Little Rock. They were talking about holding the vote open to bring Pryor back to D.C., which would have gotten ENDA to 50 votes and Gore breaking the tie. And it ends up stalling out. And so here you see the actual vote. That these documents are things I found in my research for the book. And what's notable about this is not just obviously seeing the real-time roll call, but it's signed by Ted Kennedy to Scott Hitt, who is a prominent AIDS doctor in Los Angeles and a sort of big gay rights activist. He's thanking them for their support. This was seen as close to a victory as gay rights activists were getting on Capitol Hill at the time, coming up one vote short on ENDA. And it was possible because this thing had been paired with DOMA. One of the ironies is we're now here 25 years later. Same-sex marriage is the law of the land. Things that Chuck Robb were saying that day that seemed exceedingly far-sighted, if not out of time, have come to pass and are now sort of taken for granted. And yet the Equality Act, which is the successor bill to ENDA, is still basically fighting to get just a vote in a Democrat-controlled Senate. And so it was that these things got it was a sort of shotgun marriage of these two bills that nobody had ever expected would come together, but they influence one another in a whole bunch of different ways.
That's fascinating. I think we're going to see one clip and then we'll hear from David. I think this clip is a real interesting one. Hopefully Mary will get it up, about where Chuck Robb goes into the comparison to Loving versus Virginia.
Discrimination. Until 1967, 16 states, including my state of Virginia, had laws banning couples from different races to marry. When the law was challenged, Virginia argued that interracial marriages were simply immoral. The trial court upheld Virginia's law and asserted that, quote, Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. I'm quoting from Loving versus Virginia, 388 U.S. 1, 1967. The Supreme Court struck down these archaic laws, holding that, quote, the freedom of choice to marry had long been recognized as one of the vital personal rights essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness by free men, close quote. Today, we know that the moral discomfort, even revulsion, that citizens then felt about legalizing interracial marriages did not give them the right to discriminate 30 years ago, just as discomfort over sexual orientation does not give us the right to discriminate against a class of Americans today. Ultimately, Madam President, immorality flows from immoral choices. But if homosexuality is an inalienable characteristic which cannot be altered by counseling or willpower, then moral objections to gay marriages do not appear to differ significantly from the moral objections to interracial marriages.
That's so good. David, talk to us about gay rights activism at the time.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to put some other things in context based on our conversation. First of all, Chuck Robb, along with people like Bob Kerrey, also from Nebraska and a military veteran, showed enormous courage that day. They belong in profile of courage. This was done in an atmosphere where there really wasn't even support in the Democratic Party for their votes. They were told by the Democratic leadership and the party it would be understood if they had to vote yes for this. It wasn't understood by us, I can tell you that. I mean, it went to the heart of who we were, a recognition of our love, and let's be honest, 1,200 plus benefits and rights denied to our community that was granted to every other American. This was not a political issue. This was a great moral issue, as John Lewis called it at the time. And Julian Bond, who was one of my best friends, led the way in the African-American community, for example, and took just as many hits because the pastors in the African-American community wasn't as far advanced as the leadership was. This was a tough issue, a tough vote, a tough position. And, you know, I often said, people say, well, you know, you have to compromise. There was the element in the gay community that said, oh, you know, we understand, you know, how you vote. We're not going to hold it against you. And a group of us said, no, we don't understand. You don't negotiate away our freedom. You don't barter which rights we get and which we don't. There's no such thing as partial freedom. There's either freedom or you're oppressed. And I didn't understand, but it didn't, that inability to understand the cowardness of others didn't shade my absolute admiration for Chuck Robb, a heroic man, you know, and you know, a test of a good speech. When it's played 20 years later, it applies to today.
Yeah, it really does.
That was a great speech. And so that he passed that test. Anyone could listen to that speech today, I'm thinking, and say it could be applied to so many circumstances today. It was really one of the great speeches on the Senate floor. I do want to say, and this again emphasizes how far out John Lewis and Bob Kerrey and Chuck Robb and Dianne Feinstein and some others went out on a limb after the vote and after Clinton signed it, and Clinton talked about the pain it caused him to sign it. And, you know, he called me at 1 o'clock in the morning and just said, "Oh, how horrible!" And he was up late and didn't want to sign it. The fact of the matter is, within a week, the Democratic Party was running ads on Christian broadcasting stations bragging that they had passed DOMA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on stations that they didn't think we would listen to. It just amazes me. Like, really, do you think we just live in this bubble? I mean, I was born gay, but I was born intelligent too. I was born with the ability to have a great knowledge on Africa and other things. I mean, it was this almost prison of the mind that if you acknowledged that you were homosexual, you had no other talents. Or if you were acknowledged as homosexual and you had great talents in other fields, it was exceptional instead of a way of life. And if you were homosexual and had great talents in the arts, well, that was to be expected. And it was exactly for these reasons that this legislation was so devastating to us. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what was, as Sasha pointed out, a non-issue in the community, it became a major issue in the community because of this vote. If it had never been that, the intensity would have never grown as quickly as it did for marriage in the community. There was such outrage among us at the cowardness of many in the Democratic Party, and gratitude to people like Senator Kennedy, who stood by our side every second of the way in this battle. I mean, let's not forget the greatest senator, I think, in our history. So the dynamics of it was, it didn't need to be in the Senate. It should have never gotten out of the House. Bill Clinton made it an issue, let's be honest, by coming out for DOMA while it was still in the House. And then from that moment on, it was inevitable that it was going to be voted on. And we can't forget that stuff. I mean, some of these people are very good people, but on this issue, they were cowards. And it's not exactly that Clinton was in a close election with Robb Dole. I don't know of anyone that expected Dole to walk away with the 96 election. But it was a devastating blow to the LGBTQ plus community. I wept at the vote. I wept as much for those who I thought would be with us, who took the easy path of morality, who put aside their principles and their values of freedom for all people for political reasons. And those who didn't, like Senator Robb, will be enshrined in our hearts forever.
Oh, thank you, David. That's very touching. Let's kick it to the very last clip of the speech that we have is the end of the speech, where Chuck Robb has his kind of rallying cry to his other senators. And then let's kick it over to Jonathan, who has been so patiently waiting to give us some context in the larger political context. So Mary, if you could get that last clip up.
Most of us are uncomfortable discussing in public the intimacies of life. And most of us are equally uncomfortable with those who flaunt their eccentricities and their nonconformity, whether gay or straight. But in the end, we cannot allow our discomfort to be used to justify discrimination. We are not entitled to that indulgence. We cannot afford it. But doing the right thing is not always easy. And I know this is not an easy vote, even for those who may agree with my argument. It is, in a very real sense, a test of character. And I hope as many of our colleagues as possible will take the time to reflect before casting their vote. If enough of us have the courage to vote against the Defense of Marriage Act, I believe we can convince the president to do what I know in his heart of heart he knows he should do to this discriminatory legislation. A nation as great as ours should not be enacting the Defense of Marriage Act. Ultimately, Madam President, I would say to our fellow senators, you don't have to be an advocate of same-sex marriages to vote against the Defense of Marriage Act. You only have to be an opponent of discrimination. Madam President, I'll conclude today with the words of a courageous American whom I seldom quote, but to whom I'm eternally indebted. President Lyndon Johnson often said, quote, "It's not hard to do what's right, it's hard to know what's right." Madam President, we know it is right to abolish discrimination. And if we reflect on what this bill is, an attempt to discriminate rather than on what it is packaged to be, a defense of marriage, we will come down on the right side of history. With that, Madam President, I thank the chair and I yield the floor.
That gives me goosebumps every time I watch it. Jonathan, give us some context for the political landscape at the time.
Well, thanks for having me. Right to hear Senator Robb there quote his father-in-law in a very different context is striking. And if you link that to the case that he made about Loving versus Virginia, the famous Supreme Court case in 1967 that allowed interracial marriages, you see Robb trying to do very early what became much more common later on, which is link the fight for racial justice to the fight for gay rights. You just didn't hear that coming very often from Southern Democrats, and certainly not in 1996. But you see in him, invoking President Johnson, who, of course, politically paid a price for the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and then, of course, invoking Loving versus Virginia, what he's trying to do there and trying to sort of link the two causes. I think about when he's given this speech. It's the fall of 1996. So this is 2 years after he faced a really difficult reelection and barely beat Oliver North. And, frankly, beat Oliver North in part because there was a third party candidate in that race who took Republican votes from North that helped Robb get reelected. And frankly, the senior senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, John Warner, famously endorsed that third-party candidate, Marshall Coleman, which helped torpedo North's candidacy. So Robb has come off this very difficult race. He's one of a dwindling number of Democrats in an increasingly Republican state. The last time Virginia had voted for a Democratic nominee for president was for his father-in-law in the landslide of 1964. That fall, 2 months later, they're going to vote for another Republican in Bob Dole, his colleague, over Bill Clinton, even though Clinton easily won re-election. But this is a deeply red state. The governor is George Allen. The other senator is John Warner. This is not the Virginia of 2021. Hell, it's not even the Virginia of 2008 when Obama finally won the state. This is a much more conservative state, especially on cultural issues. And so he is really sticking his neck out here. And he knows that he's going to face a difficult campaign in 2000. In fact, in your great book, Alice, you make clear he doesn't want to run for re-election in 2000, and he tries to get other folks to run in his stead, and obviously does not find success, does run and loses to George Allen. And I would have to note, to be totally candid here, that part of the reason why Robb lost in 2000 was because of cultural issues. George Allen, I recall, had this mantra that Robb reflected Vermont values rather than
values too.
Values. Not terribly subtle what that meant. So Robb faced real challenges because of this vote that he took. People, I think, look at Virginia and they think of the Washington, D.C. suburbs. That's obviously the population center of the state. Virginia is a vast, vast place. In fact, the furthest southwestern reaches of the state, far southwest Virginia, That's further west than Detroit, Michigan. It's further west than 6 other state capitals besides Richmond. Kids in a few counties in that corner of the state can actually get in-state tuition at Tennessee schools because it's so far southwest. So, this is a state that's got a deeply conservative tradition in both Appalachia, the area that I'm talking about, in Southwest Virginia, but also it's got a sort of almost deep South flavor and like an agrarian flavor in Southside Virginia, which is historically where the most conservative Democrats are emerged from. And the conservative Democratic machine, the Harry Byrd machine, dominated politics in Virginia. And Robb is really the first post-Byrd Democrat to emerge on the landscape in Virginia. And by that, I mean somebody who is racially moderate to progressive and sort of culturally moderate to progressive, fiscally much more of a moderate to conservative, certainly on defense, much more of a moderate. But on culture, he's really the first Democrat in Virginia to fully break from the kind of Byrd tradition when he becomes lieutenant governor in 1977 and then governor in 1981. So I guess what I'm saying is this vote he cast in 96 is sort of part of really breaking the Democratic Party of Virginia from its sort of conservative, old guard tradition and bringing it to the modern Democratic Party and frankly closer to the National Democratic Party. There was always this sort of defensiveness among Democrats in Virginia that, we are not National Democrats, we're Virginia Democrats. And what that meant was we're more moderate, we're even more conservative than the Teddy Kennedys of the National Party. And, Robb certainly engaged in that kind of rhetorical gamesmanship, especially on defense and fiscal issues. He was a different kind of Democrat than the National Party because that, frankly, was what you had to do to win. But he never did that on sort of some of the cultural stuff, in part because he was a Marine Vietnam veteran. He had images of himself serving in Vietnam that were very helpful among certain cultural and traditional parts of the state. But on guns and certainly on gay rights, he was somebody who was ahead of his time as a Democrat in Virginia in the 1980s and 90s.
If I can just be a code word translator, in 2000, Vermont values meant something specific that isn't just like hippie, Ben and Jerry's.
No,
whatever.
Of course. Right. That's what I meant.
That year, Vermont enacted civil unions, the most expansive coverage for same-sex couples anywhere in this hemisphere. And so if in November 2000 you're being told Vermont values, that is very much a gay rights code. We're not just a kind of generic, hippie lefty. I ask you, Allison, how do you see the role of gay rights and DOMA in the 2000 election? Does he see that as I mean, he was told, and you write about this, he was warned by members of his staff and other senators that he was risking his seat by taking the vote. Did he see this as playing a role in that outcome?
Well, it's really a part of a whole narrative, and I think you get at it with the Vermont values. The other term that was used was Clinton values, and we have to remember that the 2000 race comes, basically a year after the impeachment and all of these issues of morality with the president, and so a code word for that is these Clinton values that are being hung around his neck, and his approach to 2000 was, I'm not stepping away from this. I'm not stepping away from anything that I've voted for. I believe in all of it. There's a headline in the Post that goes something like, I'd rather be right in my own mind than popular, because that was his approach to 2000 was, I'm going to do this my way.
I just want to say also, Jonathan, and to all of you, I'm humbled being on this panel with you. But let's not forget that the southwest part of Virginia was the birthplace of the moral majority, which was the movement that had led to eventually a Donald Trump. Jerry Falwell was at the height of his power in southwest Virginia.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you have actually two pillars of the modern conservative Christian movement based in Virginia. You have Jerry Falwell in Lynchburg with Liberty University, and then down in the Tidewater region in Virginia Beach, you have Pat Robertson, who is running the Christian Broadcasting Network, and who himself ran for president in 1988 and actually did surprisingly well. Both of them have immense followings in their communities and statewide, and are sort of go-to figures for aspiring Republican politicians in Virginia. Real forces to be reckoned with.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say one more thing about the speech before we eventually break. As four writers here, I just wanted to take a second to note the language where, one of the things that's remarkable about this is he's sort of, fairly direct, plain spoken, unadorned, like moral authority, but unadorned language. But then there's these little moments that you hear that particular drummer about how hard to speak, these just glimmers of poetry in this otherwise, a speech that's not trying to be high flying oratory for most of it, but he dips into that. Alice, what do we know about who wrote the speech and how much of the language was Robb's and where all that came together?
That's a really good question, Sasha. So I know that a shout out to a couple of the staff members, Kim Anderson, Ridge Schuyler, Tom Lehner, probably Susan Carr as well. I know they all had hands in it. I also know that
Linda Bird.
And Linda Bird, of course, and
was a major force.
Linda Robb, of course. But I will say that it does read. The language reads like Chuck Robb in all the complex ways. It's very hard to pull out a single quote because his sentences tend to go on a little bit. And that's just a hallmark of his language. I can see his sentence structure in there. And I also know that he's a very collaborative writer. I mean, the book that he wrote, In the Arena, that I worked on him with, he is worked with him on. He's a very collaborative. He likes to look at every word. He's not somebody who somebody else can write for, and he will just parrot those words. I am 100% sure that he went through every single word of this speech and read it out loud and nitpicked every bit of it before, 6 or 7 times before it went to the floor.
It goes to the heart of what Gandhi says. We have to value our words as much as we value our actions. I always said, I know I'm in trouble when someone says, I love you, but. I'm with you, but.
Yeah.
I've heard more buts in my life than I ever want to hear about again.
Yeah. One kind of general political thing that we haven't quite mentioned yet is just the overall support or lack of support for gay marriage at the time that this all happened. 68% of Americans did not support gay marriage at that time. And it changed so rapidly in between then and today that it feels almost like it can't have been true, the 25 years ago that many people were against gay marriage. Sasha, do you have just a minute of synopsis of how that shifted?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about one of the dynamics earlier that didn't apply to Robb, which is people knowing folks who come out as gay. I will note one thing that was in the clips of the speech that we heard, that I think, a part of the kind of far-sighted, ahead of its time quality of that speech was that underlies these changes in public opinion, how matter-of-factly Robb assumed that people are born gay.
Mm-hmm.
And, our understandings of genetics and heredity are incredibly different as a society now than they were 25 years ago, not just on issues of sexual orientation or gender identity, but like the way we talk about addiction and attitude and temper and personality traits. We just accept as a society people are born with a whole lot more baggage than we did 25 years ago. And a lot of the language that opponents of gay marriage use at the time, or gay rights generally, talking about lifestyle and choice. I mean, there were people who seriously argued in the 90s that if you let gays, and in the 2000s, if you let gays and lesbians marry, it will incentivize people to become gay. I mean, like, really, these were part of the political conversations. And what Robb talked about this in a way that feels so much closer to the way we talk about this is obviously not a choice for people today than was, I think, sort of as commonly in in circulation, certainly for people of his generation at that time. And I think that's a big part of the sort of engine of opinion change here.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about that, I asked him about that specifically because it did strike me as well when I was going through the clips of this. He doesn't have a specific reason for that. It's just that is something that was appeared obvious to him. And once he had made that decision, he just everything else flowed from there. It was kind of settled fact for him.
And I think, again, I just want to say that you cannot not mention the influence of Linda Bird Robb on her husband. Both her and Lucy, I remember from a very early stage in the marriage rights struggle, it assumed it was just an extension of their father's heroic efforts on civil rights. And they never doubted that. And she became a vocal, articulate advocate for justice for LGBTQ people.
Mm-hmm. She is a wonderful, wonderful influence. Do we have any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. You can.
It's great to
I can't believe we had an entire panel on Chuck Robb and never mentioned Doug Wilder's name. I mean, that's just,
and now you've broken the spell. Thanks.
I would just say real fast before we go, it's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it earlier this year. You don't have to be from Virginia to appreciate this book, but it sure does help because there's so much national history in it too. I mean, his life, and especially the material about Vietnam and President Johnson, it's extraordinarily vivid. I've read a ton of LBJ books over the years. I've never seen some of that history before. And a little sneak preview, if you haven't read it, there's a young senator who comes to the Johnson ranch while the Johnson family is sitting Shiva, not technically. And that senator's name is Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., who comes to Johnson City, which, by the way, I don't think there's any direct flights from Wilmington, Delaware to Johnson City, Texas. So it couldn't have been an easy trip to get down there for the young Biden, who would have then just have turned 30 years old, by the way. And he joins the Johnson family as they're mourning the late president. And Senator Robb, writes about this young senator who would have been basically his contemporary. They're about the same. I think Robb's a couple years older. That alone to me is like worth the price of admission. So,
and Biden had just taken his Senate seat, and he had just been through his own tragedy. And
his own tragedy, exactly. Right.
I mean, it's one of those, it really shows the character of both men.
What a fascinating, I mean, that's like a Forrest Gump type moment, right? Where like Chuck Robb and Joe Biden at the LBJ ranch after Johnson's death, and like Biden had just lost his own wife and child. I mean, that's like an extraordinary moment. So anyways, buy the book, folks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jonathan and Alice. Thanks for helping make this happen.
Good to meet you, Jonathan.
Excellent.
Happy 25th anniversary, everyone.
Happy 25th.
See you guys.
See you guys. Take care.